Thanks for joining us today. I'm really pleased to be recommending Dan Tran, who is a professor at CUNY, to join us. Dan studies issues around immigration, race and ethnicity, and inequality in neighborhood. And right now, you are looking at 2/3 of our graduate cohort. So we were in a sociology and social policy program together, and we were our entire cohort. We all finished graduate school. In honor of Dan being here, I'll tell you how all of our weekly seminar series started, which was William Davis Wilson would announce we were starting, and he would do that by telling us who next week's speaker was. Say anything about this week's speaker next week. But I'm not going to do that. I'm excited about this week's speaker, although you should probably do what Bill Wilson does, not what I do. But I'm excited about Dan being here, and Dan has asked that we do things sociology style, so clarifying questions during the talk and substantive questions at the end. Turn things over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. And you should know that Sarah was always faster than the rest of us. Wonderful distinction. I'm delighted to be here, and thanks to Sarah, but also to RP for the invitation to share the work. This is work in progress, so I'm very much looking forward to your feedback. In fact, it's the first time I'm presenting this work. So the big rough is why. So here's the outline. I'm going to start with some background information, and then I'll give you two sets of empirical analyses. The first one, presenting a framework to think about intra-Asian diversity. The second one, on Asian older adults in New York City, and I'll conclude with some questions for public policy and research. So you all know that the Asian population has grown dramatically over the last 5 decades. In 1960, the rural Asian population was fewer than 1 million people, having for less than 0.5% of the total population. In 2020, is 24 million, both monoracial and multiracial Asians, 7% of the Asian population. What most dramatic, I think, is the growth between 2010 and 2020, and you can see that's roughly 10 million more people over 1 decade. Much of that growth came from migration between 2008 and 2019. More Asian newly arrived immigrants were coming compared to Hispanic immigrants. And that statistics is remarkable given the fact that Asia is thousands of miles away, and Latin America and the US shared a 3,000-mile border through Mexico. And then this trend reversed after the pandemic for multiple reasons. One other key feature about the Asian American population is the diversification over the decades. In 1960, 80% of all Asians in the US are East Asian descent. By 1980, a third are East Asian, another third came from Southeast Asia. These are the Vietnamese and the ocean and Cambodian refugees that we know about. And by 2000, it's about a third East Asian, a third Southeast Asian, a third South Asian, the most dramatically growing group. Here's the growth rate for the last decade between 2010 and 2021. You see the largest 6 Asian groups in descending order: Indian, Chinese, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese. And then a category that's called all Asian. This is a residual category. We captured about 14, 16 different smaller Asian groups that we know about, don't think a lot about. And this is a group that I'm going to focus much of my attention today on. What you also see is Koreans and Japanese have stopped coming, or at least, the growth rate for Japanese is actually negative over time. In 2022, 3 Asian countries accounted for 15% of all immigrants in the US. Obviously, Mexico is at the top. India, for the first time in a century, overtook China to become the largest Asian ethnic group in the country. So historically, Chinese were the first to arrive, and 2020 is the first time that crossing happened. Much of it had to do with the fact that the growth of the Indian population in the previous decade drove that change. Lots of you have heard and read and thought about the broader narrative on the model minority. On the left is a book on the origin of the model minority stereotype. And on the right is a book on the second generation Chinese and Vietnamese. And by and large, across multiple studies, you can sum it up in the following ways. Asian Americans are exceptional in terms of educational achievement. Not only do the children of parents with upper middle class background achieve high levels of education, but also working class Chinese are achieving exceptional levels of education. And that is sort of what we mean by the Asian American achievement paradox. But behind this, obviously, an element of that exceptional achievement is the selectivity of Asian immigrants. At the top, what you're seeing here is the comparison between US born and foreign born. And by and large, they're roughly the same in terms of BA degrees and higher, but the foreign born population is significantly less educated, at 25% with less than a high school education on the tail end. Much of that is driven by, obviously, Mexican migration, where more than half have less than a high school education compared to the US born. But when you look at the Asian population, you could see exceptional selectivity, if you will. They're more educated than the US born population. In the case of South Asian, which is the bottom bar right there, they're twice as likely to be college educated. We don't know whether the education was in the home country or in the US, but the point is they're highly educated upon arrival or throughout the years of living here in the US. And that South Asian bar mostly driven, again, by Indian Americans. I'll come back to that in a second. Moreover, they're also hyper-selected, and by this we mean a double type of selectivity. Not only are immigrants more educated than the US-born groups, including whites and blacks, but also more educated than non-migrants from their sending country. So this double selectivity is important. In our papers in the Russell Sage Journal, Jennifer Lee and I graph the achievement for 5 groups. These are the 5 largest Asian groups, and then the 2 lines are basically blacks and whites, US-born blacks, US-born whites. The blues are first generation, the reds are second generation, the greens are the non-migrants from the sending country. And as you can see, universally across these 5 groups, they're more educated than the US-born population. No, nothing surprising there. What's exceptional is when you compare the blue and the green for Chinese, for example, 55.1% of them have a college education and more, compared to only 3.6%. And that's basically 17-1. Put differently, Chinese Americans are 17 times more likely than the non-migrants in China to have a college education. So that's extreme selectivity. Same for Indians, it's basically 80% compared to 8%, so 10 times more likely. So this selectivity means that the Asian immigrants arriving from these countries alone are not only just a lot of education, but also extremely selected compared to the people from their sending countries of origin. And as Asian American transition to the labor market, the pattern is also clear. There's a bamboo ceiling on the left is a book by Margaret Sheen that documented the tremendous barriers to the achievement at the highest level. So by and large, you get jobs, entry-level positions, given the education, and then move up to middle management, and that's where the stalling happened. They're always one step away from the C-suite. Same thing for law. There have been 2 reports. This is the more recent one in 2022, I think, that documented that they made it on the way up, except for partnership at the highest level. In academia, we're not surprised to hear that they're still underrepresented in multiple ways in terms of chairs, directorships, deans, provost, and president. Extremely underrepresented both in the public but also the private sector. However, the more recent work has shown that this bamboo ceiling, if you will, or this underrepresentation in terms of leadership is limited to only East Asian and not South Asian. And through a series of experimental study, Jackson Liu at MIT documented this extensively. One reason, obviously, is language, right? Because the Chinese immigrants arrive without speaking English, and Indian immigrants have that advantage, and therefore, are much more likely to achieve. But it's not just that, because if you look at, this is a piece from the India Times Lab in 2023, what you're seeing here is the top kind of billion-dollar companies, 21 of them are of Indian origin, and the names on the right-hand side you're familiar with, right? I mean, Google, Microsoft, IBM, Vanguard, YouTube. Moreover, what's surprising about this group is that many of them actually are educated in their home country in India, not here in the US. If so, it's probably a grad degree, not the undergrad degree. So these are what we call more recent immigrants, first-generation immigrants. And when you look at the public representation and inclusion of Indian Americans, I think it's exceptional in all different ways. I mean, you recognize these people, but Haley and Ramaswamy were the two contenders for the Republican Party last year, and on the right is Usha Vance. All three of them are second-generation US-born Indian Americans. On the left is our former president, who's half Indian, half African American. This is exceptional by every measure because 100 years ago in 1924, Indian Americans were not eligible to naturalize to become US citizens. That was total exclusion back then. And here we are 100 years later. I would argue full inclusion is the highest level of public life, which is actually much more important symbolically than just sort of educational attainment and income and wealth, which is what we measure very well as sociologists. So the first piece I want to show you and share with you is about intra-Asian diversity. This is in collaboration with my student at Center Xiao Pan. And here what we're trying to do is think about the other Asian, the category of other Asian beyond the 6 largest Asian group that we don't think a lot about, and think about how we can model this intra-Asian diversity, this tremendous heterogeneity into some conceptual thinking behind it. So there are 2 major approaches to study Asian Americans. The first is what's called a race-based approach. So Asians as a racial group, and then you control for Asian compared to Black, White, and Hispanic. What we refer to, race scholars refer to this as the ethno-racial pentagon, the 5 categories that we use to think about the world and simplify everyone else. The 5th is Indigenous Americans. And here the emphasis is basically on Asians as a racial group, and intra-Asian differences are basically invisible to the analyses, but also to the readers. And the emphasis has always been on the largest Asian group because altogether, depending on the year, they account for 85% of all total US Asian population. Leaving behind 15% for the 2015 other smaller Asian group. Think about this for a second. In practical terms, if you give a survey of 100 people, 85 of them are from the 6th largest group, and you have 15 people from the other 15 Asian ethnic group. So by definition, our knowledge about Asian Americans are driven by and large by these 6 largest groups, starting with Indians and ending with Japanese. And the other Asian is what I call invisible Asian Americans. The other approach is to think about ethnic categories, right? And this is important because ethnicity is multidimensional. It captures, at the minimum, ethnic identity, culture, and community, but also ethnic capital, social networks, and ethnic institutions that facilitate education, income, and so on and so forth. The challenge with this approach is sometimes we can essentialize ethnicity a little bit too much, like the Chinese do this and therefore they succeed, and the Hmong don't do this and therefore they fail. That's very insidious in terms of comparisons, and often it struggles in the face of increasing diversification because how many ethnic categories are you going to include in your model? 15 of them, and that is sort of the 2 challenges we're facing right here. In terms of practicality, this is what you actually look at here. If you think of it as a racial group, there's US Asian, it's about level of data disaggregation. Another way is to think about sending region because somehow they're proximate to each other and therefore share some fundamental characteristics to each other. A third is just focusing on the biggest group because you argue, as I have done myself, that if you capture 6 groups, you captured 85% of all Asian Americans, and therefore you know a lot already more than 0, and therefore it's worth doing. And I think so, I agree. And then finally, you have this laundry list. 6 of them have more than 1 million people in terms of population. Another 8 have more than 100,000 people. And there's another 8 more group that the list here have about less than 100,000 population among Asian Americans. Why does it matter? You look at any of these graphs, and just one example, multiple examples I can give. BA completion, MA completion, and then share of people earning $200,000 household income and higher. So these are the highly achieving group among individuals aged 25 and older. This is like ACS, CPS. And what you can see here is the all Asian, which is the average for all Asian group, is 55%. Put differently, more than half of all Asian Americans in the US have more than a college education. That's impressive. But when you compare to the groups that you see on the dark blue, it's only Indian, Chinese, and Korean exceeding that. Everyone else fell short of that. So that average really conceal, and this is an argument that has been made by multiple people, not just me, conceal the inequality among the Asian racial category, essentially, is what we're doing. So in a recent paper, I tried to advance a conceptual framework for understanding intra-Asian diversity. How do we think about this? Think about this in two different ways. One is a group level of simulations on the y-axis. What you're seeing here is the level of simulation for a bunch of Asian groups. Let me start with the left-hand side, which is what we call the assimilated groups. These are people who have high levels of assimilation to U.S. society, and those are the hyper-selected groups you saw earlier. Not only in terms of education and income, but also residential integration, social network, mainstream society, and so on and so forth. These are the highly upwardly mobile, highly educated Asian Americans, probably like me, who are here, right? Because we, by virtue of our education, we are accepted, integrated as part of the mainstream society. On the further right-hand side, groups are basically racialized, right? Like the Hmong, the Cambodians, and the Ocean. They are often left out of the higher selected kind of mainstream. There's an American mainstream, that is, and in the middle just groups that are middling in terms of educational achievement. This is more heuristic than an actual classification, so I just want to invite you to think about this in this way. At the individual level, though, even when you think about any of these given ethnic group, let's take Indian Americans. When I tell you 77% of Indian Americans have a BA degree or higher, that means 23% of them do not. So within any particular ethnic group, there's always tremendous heterogeneity. And by saying Indian Americans are highly achieving exceptional achievement, we're also ignoring the challenges and vulnerability among the Indian Americans who are working class and not the affluent Asians. So that's the divide I'm drawing. On the one hand, high levels of achievement at the individual level, as affluent Asian and the working class are basically the opposite of that divide. So these 2 by 3 give you 6 different groups. Let me start with the top two on the left, A and B. So on the high end, if you come from a group with significant levels of achievement, and you yourself are highly educated and selected, then you are basically what we describe as a hyper-selected Asian. You have few challenges, if any, in terms of integrating to the mainstream. Yes, you could be casually discriminated against in everyday life, but by and large, your life is more integrated than the rest of the other cells. The underachievement of Asian American in cell B is the opposite of that. They underachieve compared to the hyper-selected group, which is in terms of their group background, they have failed to achieve the expected level of education for their group. These are the Chinese who basically somehow have no college education, who did not even go to college. How is that possible? If you're an Asian American, you don't have a college education, you have failed tremendously. So under and overachievement is relative to the category that is above and below. At the other end, and the final cell F is what I'm mostly focusing on right now on my research, and that's called vulnerable Asians. These are groups that are highly marginalized, highly racialized, but they themselves also struggling to make ends meet. And that group is often silent, invisible for much of our research. By contrast, if people come from those groups, like my other colleague, Zhuo Wang, who struggled among the first generation and yet achieved tremendous mobility by the second generation, that they're overly achieving, and that's E right there, compared to that which their background would predict. So that's what I meant when I say over and underachievement. And in the middle, it's sort of like average, what I call ordinary Asians and an achieving Asian, that is achieving based on what we would expect. So how do we think about this tremendous heterogeneity in a way that is more than just what I call the kitchen sink approach, or David Fitzgerald described this as the ethno-racial Olympics, which is slice the data as many as you can so that every single group is represented and given voice and visibility. And that's inclusion. In my mind, that's not, but this is one approach, right? So can we think about how to summarize high heterogeneity in a way that's conceptually meaningful, that's methodologically flexible, and also empirically generalizable? And this is what we're trying to do next. So we're using latent class analyses, sort of a cluster analysis technique that Phyllis has used successfully in her work on Mexican migration from Mexico and the different streams of Mexican migration, immigrants who have arrived. The idea is that there's some latent class underlying the data you're trying to identify. Subgroups are not basically observed, but you have a set of manifest categorical variables that you have to model that with. So the latent classes, by the way, the latent classes here indicate the 6 classes of people I just showed you, right? Those are the latent classes independent of ethnic origin, which is to say you can be Chinese or Indian and you still can be vulnerable Asians. You could be Vietnamese or Laotian or Hmongs and you still can be highly achieving. So ethnic category origin is not part of the equation in terms of how we're predicting these classes, if you will. And conceptually, it's basically X is the latent, and then ABCD are the categorical variable that we observe, basically the education, income variables that we have in the census in all of our surveys. In our case, we use these variables. We try to use fewer than more to predict these latent classes. Any questions so far before I move on and on forever? You can interrupt me really anytime you want.
Sure.
Yeah.
On the latent class, you just ran that generically on the sample, or
Yes. Without making the assumption
to
about the
identify
data.
subgroups based upon these, and nativity is
It's like immigrant
less
generation
versus
plus
for
the
not
second generation.
national origin.
Yes, nativity has to do with immigrant generation. So your first generation, your immigrant, second generation, your US born to immigrant parents, and the third generation would be US born to US born parents and more. If the data allows it. If the data doesn't allow it, then it would be just foreign born and native. You look puzzled, let me explain. So we use CPS and ACS, but let me start with CPS. CPS gives you a variable called parent to birthplace question, which allows you to identify the second generation. ACS does not. So in ACS, you can only tell if the person is US born or foreign born. That's it. Okay, you could be US born of 15th generation or US born of second generation. And that's the distinction between nativity / immigrant generation. Does that help at all?
Yeah.
Thank you. And we're going to do it for the largest Asian group, but really our focus is the other Asian group, and that's what we're going to do. We do 30 iterations, and then we predict the class membership. Most importantly, I just want to say the interpretation of the classes are theoretically guided and subjective. And as you could see, the model gives you 6 classes. They tell you 6 is the optimal numbers of classes, but they don't tell you which of these classes mean what. And that's what you have to figure out. That has to be theoretically guided, because that's the assumption that we bring in. So we use the basic AIC, BIC, and for those of you who don't know, well, I'm sure you do, these are just sort of some heuristics to guide the model selection process. The smaller the value, the better. But if you look at the AIC and BIC here, the AIC continued to decrease, but BIC stabilized after 6. And that's why the combination of 2 criteria basically gave us the 6 classes, which is what we're predicting. Full disclosure, we did not go into this data set expecting to find 6, although my grad student certainly wanted to find 6, given the 2x3 that I outlined earlier for her. We truly didn't look for 6, but it sort of came out to be 6. And these are early analyses, so we're still fine-tuning multiple ways of thinking about this, but this is something that we are very excited to share. So these are the 6 latent classes by the variables that we have used, and you can see all of them here, the socioeconomic, the demographic, and the geographical. For geographical, we notice it's region of the US, but also suburban residents, which is the last row. So let me start with the first 3. And these labels at the top, the hyper-selected, achieving, and whatnot, are labels that we assign for each of these columns. The model did not assign them. But if you look at the hyper-selected column, for example, what you're able to see, right, is that 80% of them have a bachelor's degree or more. This is the exceptional Indian American achievement I described to you earlier, even by the first generation, right? More importantly, over half have income more than $200,000, and basically 94% have home ownership. And they're more likely to be first generation, 3/4 first generation, and then a quarter a second generation. And then when you look at working age and female, you also see that they're very suburban. Over half live in the suburb, and most of them are concentrated in the West Coast. So that's the first column, the hyper-selected. That's the profile that we are seeing across groups, across national origin, across generation. The overachieving is what I want to draw your attention to next. You can see here that they are also educated, but not that much more educated. It's 42% BA degree or more. And then home ownership is 83%, and also 15%, earning income over $200,000. More of them are second generation, 55%, which is the second row right there under the demographic. And they are basically, again, suburban, more in the south than the west. I want to draw your attention now to the last column, which is the column I'm most interested in, which is the vulnerable Asian American population. And here the pattern is quite clear. 41% have less than a high school education, which for Asians is like extremely disadvantaged. Another 47% have a high school education only. So those 2 categories, basically 88%. Overwhelmingly less than college educated. on first generation, because by the second generation, you achieve some levels of mobility above and beyond, and also predominantly female, and they often live everywhere, but also the Midwest, and very, very urban, only 20% suburban residents. And then finally, I just want to walk you over one more column, which is the underachieving one. If you look at underachieving, what's unique, and I'm sorry that my mouse doesn't work, otherwise I can show you the exact numbers. But if you look at the underachieving, you could see here that 99% are high school graduates, but no one is college graduate. And all of them are basically the second generation. These are the people I was describing to you, right? US born, second generation Chinese or Indian American or whatnot, and somehow never went to college. Why? Right? Because by and large, many of them do go to college. If you look at high school graduation data, Asian Americans are basically universally college going. Again, not 100%, but overwhelming. So this is a group that's basically underachieving compared to what you expect in terms of where they're coming from. And the final column is the grand mean of the entire sample. This is CPS because it takes less time to run them. You have supercomputing power might be faster, but the average high quality computer would take a day or two to run some of these LCA models, depending on the sample size and the number of categories you have, the number of variables you have in the data. One unique quality of this is that you can slice them by ethnicity. Now we have some predicted probability assigned to the possibility of a person falling into one of the 6 classes, and then you can reference back by ethnic origin. So you look at this, what you're seeing here is basically the other Asian group and the 6 categories within each of them. And I gave you some proportions there just to guide our visual. Lots of information here, so I'm not going to tell you to look at everything. But I just want to show you a few very important patterns. Taiwanese, 40% hyper-selective, as we expect, because this is very much, a subcomponent of the Chinese population, right? You look at Laotians and Cambodians, 2 populations I'm quite concerned about because they're rather disadvantaged refugee groups. They're by and large achieving, suggesting that the first generation struggled, but the second generation have actually achieved somewhat average education, meaning college education and more. If you look at the vulnerable, which is the green, what you see jumping out of you will be Bangladeshi, 20% vulnerable, Burmese, 25%, and Bhutanese, 30%. Those are the 3 recent refugee groups. So the 1980s, basically the Laotian, Cambodians, and Vietnamese arrived, and then in the 2000 is Bhutanese, Burmese, and Bangladeshi. And those are the 3 disadvantaged groups. So this is sort of a validation given our prior understanding of this group, because the data cannot do everything. We are the analysts and we bring our own understanding to this process. So in some sense, it's reassuring that the Laotians, Cambodians are doing quite well. If you look at the Taiwanese, very few of them are underachieving this teeny sliver right here, right? Whereas, mostly hyper-selective. What's more important, though, that this graph shows you is that for every single ethnic group, no matter how hyper-selective or not, there's a mix of all groups of people. And if we were to just adopt this ethnic approach, what you would say, well, Indian Americans are highly educated, therefore there's nothing to worry about them, which basically means that more disadvantaged members of the ethnic group are struggling without any visibility or any support to them at all, because their group is doing well, but they are not doing well. And by contrast, this allows us to classify people, not making an assumption about the groupism and the groupiness of the population. And this is another slide I want to just sort of show you. And this is basically classifying each of these groups of people by ethnic origin. And we weighted this because by definition, you do this classification, group with a large population would dominate that category. Because if Indians are the largest ethnic group and you classify them among hyper-selected, they would be like 80% and not just a teeny part of this entire category. So we weight the sample and come up with this overall picture. Once again, I don't want to look at any particular number. The point I want to make here is simple, that every ethnic group is represented across different classes, just like the previous slides have shown you. And some of them are much more likely to be vulnerable than others. So once again, if you think about the vulnerable population, once again, the population of interest to me anyway, the 2 big groups that make up that category is the Burmese and the Bhutanese. It's the green, the dark blue, and that's about 30% of the total population. What this does is it tells me if I care deeply about the vulnerable population, and these 2 populations give me a third of the purchase toward the intervention at the policy level, because this is where the vulnerability resides. And then you could think about this as adapting to a much more, local context. For example, take the Wisconsin example. The Hmong, as you know, is a third of the Asian population, followed by a whole list of other Asian ethnicity. And if you think about the Hmong population, they also arrived at different time. Most of them arrived many, many years ago, and recent group is a very teeny sliver at 10%. So once again, you could think about this as extending to different contexts, how you can think about the locality, and the 6 or 8 or 3 or 4 categories might be different if you were to run this analysis on Wisconsin only or New York only. But the idea is that we are thinking that this could be something that's useful. So beyond Asians, and this is what I have to say, but much of my work is on Hispanics and African Americans, on Asian Americans. This is the first paper I'm writing that's exclusively mostly Asian. Is you could think about the Hispanic Latino population the same way. There's tremendous heterogeneity in terms of sending regions. There's also the largest group, there are 8 of them, and their population is about 1 million. And then there is another 18, if you were to count the population above 100,000. This group you have red. And of course, the Hispanic population complain about the same problem, which is on the one hand, you're lumping them all into the same category. The disadvantages of Mexicans are being averaged away by the advantages of the Cubans. And this would also allow us to think about this population more creatively. One of the students, Leila, is working on MENA. MENA is the same way, right? Extremely diverse, but can we conceptualize them differently? And the same actually is for Blacks as well. US Black has 3 different subgroups. The US Black for descendants of slavery, West Indians, who have been subject of lots and lots of research, and more recently, African immigrants arriving. African migration is actually on the rise and rising drastically over the last decade, especially in places like New York City. And then you could also think about the sending region, the Caribbean being one, and then the various regions of Africa. And then, of course, the same diversity that you see, 100,000 of them. So this approach, I think, in some way doesn't make any assumption about anything at all, and allow us to be more flexible in terms of our thinking. I'm going to say maybe a bit more about the second project, and I'll try to stop around 1, so we have a lot of time for comments and questions. I might go over by a few minutes, but no more than that, okay? So this is a project on aging Asian American, because this is a second population, independent of the refugees I described earlier, that is uniquely vulnerable in our data. And this is a project with a colleague of mine, Yin, on sort of the impact of anti-Asian violence on Asian Americans, elderly population in New York City. So why Asian elder adult? They're growing quickly. In 2019, 2.4 million, but it's actually drastically growing. Also, they're highly concentrated geographically. So you go to the subway of New York City, they're everywhere, because these are the migrants who arrived 60 years ago in the aftermath of 1965. They're now in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? They're also more likely to be low income. A third of them are low income, and then maybe more than 2/3 are basically low middle income. They're the most low income group across different age groups among Asian Americans. That's the bottom for 34%. And in New York City, surprisingly, there was tremendous swelling of anti-Asian violence. These are 2 images of 2 young women that were killed early 2022, right before we went to the field to collect this data. Nationally, we know that 1 in 4 Asians have experienced an anti-Asian hate crime, hate incident, hate activity. But here's why I would say a but. We also need to remind ourselves that Blacks are often more likely than Asians to experience hate crime, period. That's not surprising to us. Blacks is the top, 70%, a bit higher than Asian Americans at 16%. So I just want to always keep in context that Asian Americans are not the most disadvantaged group, and by far not the most structurally oppressed group. And therefore, I want to present this work in the spirit of a broader context. The low-income Asian older adults are what I call the forgotten Asian. Prior work has looked at the linkage between racial discrimination and mental health. Lots of it is on Asian youth, but we know nothing about the low-income older Asian, especially the impact of the anti-Asian violence during the pandemic. They're often living in low-income neighborhoods where the hate crimes are more likely to happen, and they have tremendous significant mental health challenges to report to us. They're excluded from national survey for multiple reasons, but 2 of them are cultural and linguistic barriers, and they're also less likely to respond to survey. More importantly, our surveys don't survey them in their own native language. More about that in a second. So we do a pen and paper survey, the first one I've done in 15 years, actually, at a senior center in Flushing, collaborating with community. We did 415 surveys, plus a follow-up sample of 30 people that we do semi-in-depth structured interviews with. And it was early 2023, right after the peak of the anti-Asian violence. It focused on health, and we really were very careful about assessing the different health outcomes, PTSD, anxiety, depression, and stress, also health status, and also change over time. Change over time, I should say, is retrospective. It's not longitudinal. Ideally, we want longitudinal data, but this is retrospective. Lots of limitation, and this is something I'll come back to at the very end. The cultural sensitivity in assessing the outcomes. There's a cultural bias in underreporting among Asian Americans. This is documented, but more so for the aging Asian Americans who confuse some of the symptoms that they have, like I couldn't sleep, with I'm just getting old and therefore I cannot sleep. These are not the same thing, but they think that's the same thing. And we are interested in the impact of anti-Asian violence. And basically we asked if you have ever experienced anti-Asian violence yourself, meaning you have been verbally or physically attacked over the last few years. 22% of them said yes. Whether your family or friends have experienced it, 5% said yes. And whether you saw the news, 69% said yes. So we're collapsing this into two categories. One is personal experiences, which is the first two category, and the second is basically just reading news about anti-Asian violence if you have not experienced personal experience already. And then there's a vignette study that I'm not going to talk about because I don't have time, but basically we create 4 hypothetical profiles of Asian American elders with clear symptoms of depression that we know in terms of scale of 1 to 4. And then we asked our respondents to assess these profiles and tell us how severe they think this hypothetical person is in terms of the depression and the symptoms that we are describing. And then we also have an info treatment with preconditions of Trump prime and Biden prime and a neutral prime. And here, the idea is that Trump would trigger anti-Asian sentiment, Biden would argue against anti-Asian hate, and the neutral condition is just for control. For today, I'm just going to talk about the first part. This is the scale, you know this, lots of you have done this, and this is the translation in Chinese. We translated every single one of them. This is the PTSD scale, 14 of the 17 questions of the PTSD civilian scale. So this is the first slide of the findings on the anti-Asian violence. So each of these outcomes have 2 rows. The first one is experience anti-Asian violence yourself. The second one is reading news about anti-Asian violence, and these are the 50th, 75th, and 90th percentile. And we gave you the scale at the top, which is how moderate or severe the anxiety level is. And basically across the outcome, the finding is very clear. 25% of those who experienced the anti-Asian incident reported elevated levels of anxiety, depression, and so on, compared to only 10% from the group that is not experienced any Asian violence. So 12 is sort of the threshold here, 10 to 14, right? So the 75th percentile, I mean 25% reported high levels of anxiety, and then here only 10% higher level of anxiety compared to the 90% below. And that's sort of the same pattern across the 4 outcomes, with the exception of the last one, which is stress, and the stress is a bit higher across the board. But again, stress is also the lowest threshold of the 4 measures in terms of mental health outcomes. It's what the most commonly experienced one. And this is just the 4 outcomes with multiple coefficients and whatnot. But in the interest of time, I will just focus your attention to the top. The first one is the estimate on personal experiences. It's a dichotomous variable that tells you that those who have personal experiences with anti-Asian violence are more likely to report all these symptoms across the board, significantly more likely, controlling for everything else that we know. Again, is that surprising? No, it's not surprising. But we did it because we didn't see any research that documented this empirically. It's somewhat humorous because Bill Wilson once told me, we know that stopping welfare is going to affect negatively the younger people, the single mothers, and yet we have to launch an entire research project to document that so that we can bring it to the policymakers. And in some ways, just interesting. One other thing that we control for that you cannot see right here is, whether you have ever had COVID, and it's other variables that give you a sense of what they are doing, what they were doing before the pandemic. One other slide on the interaction between social support and personal experiences with anti-Asian violence. This is just showing you that This interaction is significant for 3 out of the 4 measures, with the exception of PTSD. And PTSD is the variable that we're most interested in because that's the variable that's most proximate to the experiences of anti-Asian violence. Because that's the variable we're trying to capture most. Correlated with the other 3, but that's the variable that we're most interested in. So living with someone helps mediate the negative impact of these incidents, but it doesn't help much with the PTSD example and experience. I'll skip this slide and just bring it to an end so I can get your thought and reaction. I don't want to talk for too long. So let me just end by saying a few more things. First, there are 4 categories of vulnerable Asian Americans that I think a lot about. The first one is Asian refugees. I already told you about them, but in 2023, 26,000 of them were admitted, and they accounted for 45% of all refugees admitted to this country. They're a big chunk of the refugee population. One group that I said nothing about today is the Afghans, where we have no research because they most recently arrived over the last 2 years. The second is Asian older adults. We know this already. It's 5% of all older adults. It's a teeny fraction, right? But it's 1 out of 7 Asian American older adults. 1 out of 7 Asian Americans are of age 65 and above. Think about that. That's a lot. The third group is a group that my colleague Amy Sheen and Sophia Aptica has done a lot of work on, undocumented Asian. This is also a group that flies under the radar. We don't think of them as undocumented. It's also 1.7 million in 2022. Yesterday, there was an article about how the first plane bringing Indian Americans are returned to India. This is the first deportation, if you will, to India using military plane. And 1 out of 7 undocumented are Asian. 1 out of 7 undocumented individuals in the US is of Asian descent. That's a substantial number. And 1 out of 8 Asian immigrants are undocumented. And more importantly, 80% of them are from the more highly educated groups I just told you about, the Indians, the Chinese, the Filipinos, and Koreans. So their plight in some ways are folded within the exceptional achievement narrative, and that's really where we are, which is that, complete invisibility. And the final group is LGBT Asian American. And there's some smattering of work. Some very rough estimate is about 560,000 people, about 5% of all Asian American population. But there's tremendous limited data and estimate. For now, my attention is on the first 2, not the last 2, because I'm very focused on the Asian older adults, is really the population I'm most passionate about right now. So why are we facing this challenge? Because there are many major barriers to research on US Asian. This is more of conceptual method talk, which I know is a bit boring, but I hope you'll bear with me. Because there's not a lot of representative samples of Asian respondents, but we also need ethnicity level data, which is almost impossible. The inclusion of Asian smaller group is also very expensive, and there's very limited coverage of health, savings, and retirement. These are topics that are really important to Asian American adults. Just to give you a sense, okay, this is just a table. We tabulated like a few common data set. ACS, CPS is at the top. Only ACS was conducted in English, Spanish, and only Asian languages. That's the only survey. Everything else is English and Spanish, including CPS. What does that mean? It means that the people that we try to track down in New York City, the low-income Asian American who don't speak any English, are not part of any of these samples except for ACS. But that also means that we know nothing about it, okay? 60% of our sample don't speak English at all. And they're low income, so they don't have internet. A third of them have no internet. Another third have difficulty connecting to the internet, and a third have full internet. And think about the survey that we do, everything that we do. So doing this type of work is extremely expensive because you have to translate the instrument, having bilingual interviewers, and so on and so forth. And when you look over here, when it comes to ethnicity level, these 3 surveys have ethnic level data, but last I checked, is restrict data access to an enclave. You have to apply, just like any other restricted access to census data. They're from the CDC. And then when you look at the sample size, it's hardly anything. You have 1,500. Once you slice it, I told you before, 85% are going to be the top 5 groups or 6 groups, and then you are left with 100 people that captured the other 15 groups. This is a major problem because accurately counting and capturing the experiences is a civil rights issue for the groups that are much more vulnerable and disadvantaged. And then there's also tremendous, effort to fill this gap. The NAS survey, the Pew Asian American survey, and Amplify API. These are three that I know of that are conducted in Asian languages. But funding is a very, very major area toward this type of work. And then, there are, and I haven't seen this enough for Asian American, but I'm very encouraged to see what's being done here by Wisconsin, that their administrative data linkages that will allow you to get much larger samples of Asian American from the smaller groups, because you get the entire sample and not just a sample of a population. Funding. I must end with this because this is a very often cited statistics. 0.17% of all NIH funding over like 2 decades went to Asian American research. Less than half a percentage point. And why? Partly, not only, Asians are not seen or counted as an underrepresented group because given education, income, and wealth, they are exceptional. And fair, I think that's a fair point. But that's also one reason, that's not the only reason. And then more importantly, where do Asians fit is the question. And Jennifer Lee and I have written about this, and we argue that Asians fit awkwardly because we don't have the historical legitimacy of Blackness with generations of oppression and marginalization. They deserve the attention that we pay to them. And we also don't have the cultural privilege of whiteness. So we'll be tricks in between, and therefore that's where we are. At the same time, we also warn about the false equivalency of non-white disadvantages. And this is something I said earlier, which is that Asians are not as oppressed, as marginalized as the other group, who have resources in some way and not other ways. Also, this is a plug for a new PhD program that I just launched at the CUNY Grad Center. It's a Discipline Plus PhD program. But we named the program Black, Race, and Ethnic Studies, intentionally to capture 3 different dimensions of this ethnic studies place. Black studies, and Blackness is exceptional. Critical race studies and critical ethnic studies. If doctoral students or prospective doctoral students, please send them to us. Admissions are going to open in fall 2025 for the first course to arrive next fall. But the final thing I'll leave you with is academic gatekeeping. And this is the final chart I'll show you. These are the publications in the top leading journals by discipline across 5 different disciplines across 20 years. We just literally counted every single article that has anything to do with Asian American. And the finding is clear. For econ, right here, is 0 across 20 years. And this is, AER, ASR, AJS, for social forces, for sociology, AJPR, APSR for political science. And then demography is actually doing quite well. Sociology is doing better now over time. Sociology is this red light. And then by 2022, we're at the top. But even at the top, it's only 6 articles across the entire 3-year period because we combine them. There's so few articles to count that combine 3 years and we get 6. And that's the highest. And the rest is basically 4, 3, and 2 in 2022. So I think there's an element of academic gatekeeping. And I think this actually connects back to what I said about funding and data infrastructure. We don't have good enough data to be published at the top journals because the data is just not there. It's too expensive for young scholars to collect this type of data. So, for example, we collected a pen and paper survey. We were well aware this is a convenient sample. We also were well aware that peer-reviewed journals want to look at us and say, this is a very bad sample in every single way of the sampling approach, which is also why we embedded a vignette study and a framing experiment to get around the poor quality of the data we're collecting, because arguably could convince some people that this is an experiment of some sort, imperfect, however it is. But this is a problem, and these 2 things are connected. I just don't want to say it's gatekeeping, it's actually funding and data infrastructure, and the next generation is struggling because of it. I will skip the rest of it to just say that the title of my talk is From Intra-Asian Diversity to Narrative Plentitude. But before we get to plentitude, we have to understand what scarcity is. And this is Viet Thanh Nguyen writing about crazy rich Asians. You remember this movie in 2018? How many people have seen this movie or heard of it? I went to see this movie in a theater for the first time in 15 years of my life. That's the only movie I saw in a theater. Because Jennifer Lee wanted to come and another colleague wanted to come. So we went because we were so excited. It's the first all-Asian cast movie since the Joy Luck Club, which is in 1993, 25 years. Why did it take so long to have this movie to be made? It's not even a good movie, by the way. But Viet Thanh Nguyen, one of my co-ethnics, who was professor of English at USC, basically said, We need more of these movies, even mediocre ones, because we live in an economy of narrative scarcity in which we feel deprived and must fight to tell our own stories and fight against the stories that distort or erase us. Many Americans, he said, will take these Asian images, which are usually awful, and transfer them to any Asian Americans that they encounter. And that's why narrative scarcity is really important. This is an interview he did with Maxine Hong Kingston, another wonderful Asian American writer. And he said here, we have economic scarcity and we don't have equal access to modes of storytelling. So with that, I'll just end with this narrative plentitude, which is really what this project and many other people working in this space are not the only one. I just want to stress that is working to raise the visibility for multiple types of Asian American experiences, shifting away from this mono narrative of Asian American success, such that we would have a more narrative plentitude future. So with that, I'll pause and have to ask any questions, and we can have a conversation hopefully about any of these topics. So thank you. We have no question to go on for a long time. I'll wait for you. Sarah.
You say a little more about what you see as solutions. So you all have come up with one approach, which is like, we'll do an experiment and then maybe you'll be okay with our smaller sample or things like that. Do you have other things in mind as you think about how to move forward?
Significant investment in the data infrastructure that we have, such that people can add questions, like TAS, for example, is an example of this, right? You have an infrastructure and people can add questions to that infrastructure. Leading senior scholars have to launch this infrastructure and then allow people to questions as they wish, because sampling these 15 different groups well and sampling them in a way that is appropriate and culturally appropriate would be $1 million project, not $100,000 project, maybe several $1 million project. I was telling Sarah earlier about the fragile family studies, for example, not a marginalized invisible group many years ago, but because of Sarah McMillan and other people who have invested millions of dollars into it, now we have a very rich data source to study this population. We have to start somewhere, and that's where we have to start with the responsibility. And I'm very happy I'm giving this talk here at IRP in particular, because I know there's a lot of very creative, smart, talented senior scholars working in this space. And we need people like you to lead, and then we can add. And I can also say that I don't think I have the capacity to take on this project myself, because it's just too overwhelming to even think about. And it begins and ends with funding. Because no one's going to give me or anyone right now $5 million to do a project like this, because what's the value? Okay, you gain a bit more, about 15%. But we already know about 85%. You know, why do we care about the 15%? This particular political movement is also very discouraging. Because, you know, to me, and this is just an aside, and it's not a question, Sarah, but the study of race and ethnicity has political implications, but to me, it's not politically motivated. We don't do it because of political purposes. It's not because of DEI that we launched this doctoral program. This doctoral program is a systematic study of race and ethnicity, multiple ways of thinking about it, from the humanities to the social sciences, from the economists to the English scholars. It's not political, but the entire area of study has been politicized for political gains, and as a result, we're paying the price for it. And the lack of funding is a major concern, because even when you go to the census website the last week or so, you couldn't even find basic tables like what's the Asian American projection for 2060. It was there, it used to be like Google, and 3 seconds you find them, and now everything is shut down across the board. And I was just looking for descriptive statistics just to tell you what these populations look like. I couldn't find them because the PDF is there, the Excel is there, click on it, it doesn't open. And that's how severe it is. I think it's setting us back by a wide margin. Let me also say one more thing, and this is coming back to your question, Sarah. I came from Vietnam, where the data infrastructure that we have here, from the census to all of the major survey, is a dream. It's a dream that would take us half a century to build, because our data is not even anywhere near that quality. And now, if we're not careful, we're destroying that entire investment of half a century. And that is a tragedy of the highest order, just for academia and also for just knowledge generation and production. So I don't think that I don't think that some people appreciate fully what we have and how much work went into building what we have. And if you who have done the major survey, any major project, know how much work went into creating a survey and collecting samples and so on and so forth, especially when we want to do it well and not just sort of do a low quality. So I would say we need to invest very significantly, seriously across multiple institutions, across multiple senior scholars who have to take the lead, because the junior scholars' future depend on it, and they just don't have the capacity to do so. And it has to be a flexible survey structure like TESS or something like that. Actually, another example is the multiracial collaborative post-election study, CMPS. And that survey also allowed people to add on questions. So we added a question on production policy for the 2024 CMPS. It took us $10,000 to add 3 questions. It's a lot of money for a lot of scholars, especially who are coming from public institutions who don't have the significant research account that a lot of the private institutions might provide. That is an impediment. It's so sad we begin and with funding, but it is the challenge that facing all of this entire area of research. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. I tend to think about things spatially. So in this context, I'm thinking about the regional elements as well as the suburban, urban, rural continuum. And when I'm thinking about the data sources, there's been a long-standing issue, and it's reflected here in your talk today, about what is nationally represented. And looking at your results, part of what I was seeing is, a very uneven distribution of Asian populations across these spatial frames. And so when we think about existing surveys that tend to not incorporate the spatial stratified approach, how do we wrestle with that, or how are you thinking about it? Why are you thinking about it, or why not? Which is a basic question around, given this regional spatial distribution, how might that feed into our projects moving forward in sampling, or why not?
That's a great question. I'll respond in 4 ways. First is there will be tremendous variation across the country in terms of the local population. And that's why the locality has to lead. It is also why the example I gave of Wisconsin, that is unique to Wisconsin, and scholars from this university, this region have to invest in that effort, because these populations better than the rest of us. In fact, the report I'm citing from was produced by a Wisconsin scholar, whom I do not know. But I think that type of locality specific analysis have to be done, which is also why we're thinking of a framework that's flexible enough that you can adopt and adapt in multiple ways. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation recently released a call for funding on data disaggregation among AAPI population that could be generalizable across the country. We submitted a proposal for this opportunity from CUNY through the Asian American Research Institute. And our study was a New York State study with implications for the country. We were not funded because our focus is too small on only New York State, but we only felt that was the only thing we can focus on, because that's where we can do a good job of. And that was one reason why it was not funded, I think. And that is my second, my third point is on this chart I show you, there's another column I didn't show you, I cut it down. And the 5th column is actually New York State sample size. And it drops so dramatically that by the time you get to New York State, you cannot even do anything with the major survey. Only the census, but not the major survey. So that comes back to the sample size question. And I also think that there might be, and this is my final point, creative ways in which we can, leverage the more big data, wave that we have to come up with new ways of measuring these things, the existence of ethnic businesses in a particular location as independent survey, Yelp reviews. So there are ways in which we can capture these populations in their day-to-day life in ways that are different from the standard approach of ethnicity and race. And let me add one final footnote. in approaching this entire analysis of LCA, we're not saying LCA will replace ethnicity. I just want to be clear, it's not going to replace ethnicity. It's both of these approaches are complementary depending on what we need and when we can and cannot do certain analysis. At the absence of ethnicity level data, well, maybe this is a way for us to get closer to that. When we have ethnicity data, then we often, and in my other work I do, compare the predictive power of an ethnic variable and the LCA variable and see which one is more or less predictive and why. And that's another way to think about this more holistically, but absolutely space is crucial to this narrative of Asian American experiences. And one final footnote, you look at the Asian American population in New York and LA, but especially Chinese American. The Chinese Americans in New York are so much less selected compared to the Chinese Americans in LA. So that itself tells you something, right, about the selectivity of migration flow to a particular location. And what does it mean for our understanding of Chinese Americans? Because that comes back to my prior point. All of the study about second generation about New York and LA, that's all we know. And that's how we project to the rest of the second generation across the country from Chinese background. And we haven't done anything beyond the big groups at all. And that, I think, is why I'm hoping that the next generation would pursue some of these topics. It's a scary place to be honest, to do this type of work, because sometimes you're preaching to the choir and then people stop and end with, how do you have the funding to do so? Yes.
Thank you so much. This was just eye-opening in so many ways. I guess maybe my question is a little bit more of a dream. If you had all of the data in the world and really thinking about your interest in older generations in the framework, I think as I was watching, I was hearing a little bit more about the older Asian generations. I wondered if how time, age plays into how folks might fall into the 6 categories or the framework. And so, like, thinking about if you had the sample of older folks and you had the end to do an LCA, like, would the way people, because they probably came at a different time in a different context, how would it look different? Who was represented in each of these different sectors? So yeah, I think that's a little bit where I was.
So my first response is a paper I'm trying to write. I say trying to write because I've not been successful, but it's an APC approach to integration, which look at age, period, and cohort, which is basically what you're saying.
Right.
People arriving at different cohorts have different characteristics. The Hmong who arrived 40 years ago are different from Hmong that just arrived last decade, and in our survey sample, 40% have been here for more than 30 years. More than 30 years in New York City, which matches our understanding of migration patterns and what are Asian Americans. And I think another 40% have been here for 10 to 30 years. And then a teeny segment. I think I was trying to think about the APC model and how it applies to this type of data creatively so that it can advances in APC approaches recently by Ethan Fossey, Chris Winfield, and others have allowed us to estimate the impact of age, period, and cohort independently of each other, making some basic assumptions and its impact on integration. And when you think of immigrant experiences, it's age, period, and cohort, but it's also age at arrival, how old you were when you came, and length of residency in the US. These 3 are basically the APC analogy of APC. So how old you are has impact on your life course trajectory. How old you were when you first arrived, like I was 19, make a difference. And how long you have been here also make a difference. All 3 are important to that. And then my final comment about the broader question you ask is, I actually don't think that having unlimited data is a good thing. Here is my other boundary. Having good quality data on a narrow scope that allow us to understand some theoretically important question is what I dream. Because having too much data, you run into what we call data mining. You get 100 models, half of them will be significant in some level. And there's machine learning, data mining, which I think is very helpful. But at the same time, my approach has always been that it has to be theoretically guided. Why are we expecting this relationship to occur? What are our priors about it? And then hopefully we can have the empirical data to test that hypothesis. So too much thing is too much. And I think having enough is perfect for me.
Else has a question. I have more questions. You're asking, in the survey you all did, you're asking about a lot of dimensions, and you referred to some ways in which the cultural interpretations of some of those things you're asking about might vary. How do you think about managing that in doing this research as you move forward?
So the vignette study is actually very helpful. So we have 4 different hypothetical profiles, and then we ask them to rate these people with symptoms that objectively we know, from mild to severe. The findings from that entire study is as follows, very straightforward, shockingly straightforward. In one word, it's regression to the mean. So respondents would now rate the severity of those who have severe depression and would uprate the severity of those who have mild depression. So it's basically, if it's 4, they're more likely to say 3. If it's 3, they're more likely to say 2.5. And if it's 0, 1, or 2, they're more likely to upgrade it to 1.5 and 2.5. So that's the regression to the mean. Another interpretation of this that my colleague Najin had given me, and I think is true, is the culture of middle way. So in some East Asian culture, you prefer the middle path. You don't go to the extreme. So that's one way in which this cultural preference exhibits in the way they're rating these individuals. So that's the result. And then now that we have the result, we can include that in some of our models, because that also is a way to correct for one problem I told you before and have time to talk about it fully, and that's under and over reporting. So to extend that individuals in the sample are more likely to under or over report something, controlling for that from an independent variable in the model would allow us to predict better outcomes for the anxiety, depression, PTSD that we have. Now, just to be clear, we only have one measure, and that's depression. The vignettes are only about the depression, but we know that it's correlated in some way. So controlling for that allows to remove, if you will, right, extract away the share of over reporting that have biased estimates in terms of the outcome. So that's a second way we can use it. And the third way, I think, is beyond us. I have the intention, I don't think we should do it, is to revise the questions. But I don't think we have the expertise to do it. I think some group of psychologists and psychiatrists should revise it. So 3 examples. 1, sleeping. Right? I don't sleep at all. I'm old. I only sleep 2 hours a day. That has nothing to do with depression. One of the questions was sleep. Second is worrying a lot. So our respondents said to us, as an immigrant who's low income, who doesn't speak English, I worry about everything in my life. So of course I worry a lot. So you have 2 ways to think about this, right? One is, okay, this is perpetually anxious as a person, and this is an underlying anxiety that you have, or they just don't see that as a symptom of anxiety, they just see that as a struggle of infant life. So that's a second very clear example that they told us. And the third is sometimes they don't understand some of the questions because some of the questions are repetitive in different ways, trying to capture different dimensions, and they get confused by the 4th and 5th questions. Each of these paragraphs is 17. And they read and they were like, this is similar to the previous one, is it right? And some of them actually don't even read. Some of them actually we did one-on-one interview because they couldn't read. This is a piece of it, they're illiterate. And then I already had to sit with them for an hour to complete the survey. We asked them the question, we recorded the responses. And then sometimes with the big magnifying glasses for them because they couldn't read with regular glasses. So there's a lot of very interesting things that we learned during this field work about how difficult it is to do this type of survey and do it well. And it's unclear whether when we publish the paper, that's the first paper we wrote. So I hope it's going to be published. If you ever review my paper, please accept it. Yes, Judith.
Is there, in the interviews especially, does it come out how aware, especially the underachieving or the vulnerable kind of folks who fall into those categories, how aware they are of that stereotype of the very high achieving Asians, that kind of monolithic idea, and how far away from that idea they are?
They're very aware. A big part of it is because our sample is Chinese Americans in New York. So that's a very unique sample because Chinese Americans are the group that are most associated with this model minority stereotype. So they're very aware of this stereotype because their children, by and large, are overachieving. These are working class Chinese, not middle class Chinese. Vivian Louise wrote a book about uptown Chinese and downtown Chinese, comparing two groups of Chinese, one working class, one middle class. And she found clear class differences between the two. One group was sampled from Columbia, the other one was sampled from Hunter College. These are young people. So class does matter. And for our respondent, even though they're working class, they're aware of the achievement of their friends and friends of friends and children of friends of friends. So they're aware of this framing. And by and large, they said that, my children have been doing quite well, but I'm still here because I live in this ethnic neighborhood. And I don't want to become a burden on them. So they're very independent, I think, in spirit as well. They're aware, but now shifting away from the Chinese to answer your question more holistically, many of these groups don't really, these are, what we call academic categories that we impose upon this population. They don't walk around thinking, oh, I'm disadvantaged, I'm vulnerable, I'm triply disadvantaged. They're just who they are, right? And they see challenges in their daily life, to be sure. They understand that sometimes it's hard to navigate, especially when you get a letter. My parents are classic examples of this. Every single letter they get, it looks official, including scam letters and tax property letters. They said, okay, there's a letter coming today. I don't know what it is. You can take a look and see if there's anything wrong. And I was like, I don't care. I don't want to read this letter. I don't want to open them. But they were very concerned because they couldn't understand, they couldn't read, and therefore they don't understand what's going on. This is how their entire life. So I think the struggles are there, but to place them in broader academic templates and language, the way they place it, is an exercise that's more heuristic that we do as academic to understand, because for every category we come up with, there are always messy boundaries in between. If you specify this with 50 iterations, it might give you 8 categories, not 6. If you have a different set of variables, it might come out differently. So at some level, it's an art as much as it's a science. In estimating this model, we try our best to get it right, and we're going to do this for ACS next. And you also notice we segregated ACS and CPS between the 6 group and the smaller group. Ideally, it has to be a big analysis of all of the groups. But we just felt like there's just so much on the 6 groups already that we didn't want to spend more time on it. We want to shed light on the smaller groups that we know nothing about or very little about. Quite frankly, there have been a lot of research, all of them qualitative studies, case studies of these different groups for the same reason I just described, which is samples are representative of the national, which is not there. So, Max.
Yeah, so in thinking about the conceptual frame that you set up in the ARS, which is you presented super informative. One thing I'm curious, and this is more projection than anything else into the future, which is that you have this framework of assimilated and racialized, right? And that does map on to somewhat to recency, right, in terms of growth in population and immigration rates to the U.S. Is there an expectation in the literature, or even in your own work, right, that Burmese, Bhutanese people are going to follow a similar path of assimilation as prior, immigrant groups, or is the context changing so much right now that it's not even worth thinking about projections or the future? But yeah, I'm just sort of curious how we should be thinking about the transition from racialized to assimilated.
That's a good question. And I would say 2 weeks ago, I would say there would be no changes that dramatic. But right now, I cannot be so sure anymore. So that's my first response to the broader part of it. But I think that, yes, there's a temporal assumption in this modeling. And that's also why we have the immigrant generation, which is sort of a variable that captures that temporal transition. The broader literature is clear. The master trend across multiple immigrant groups post-1965, regardless of social class and race, have been one of upward mobility, including Mexican Americans, for whom mobility has been most dramatic. Because your parents have less than high school education, you have college education, that's dramatic. If your parents have 2 PhDs, you have a PhD, that's horizontal, or maybe downward mobility. So I think that's why the expectation should be upward mobility. And it's not about an expectation that's, how shall I say this? That's not prescriptive, that's not normative. It's empirical. That's what we see in the data. At the same time, I hesitate to say this too strongly because we don't have soft measures like power, network, dominance in society. That's not measured by all these education, income, and wealth, which is like the crudest measure that we have. It's the only one that we have for all of these different groups for the reason I outlined before. So it's actually a very teeny slice of the reality that they live, and there's a lot more that we don't measure. Enough social network in particular. Fabian, I'm looking at you. Social network in particular is like to understudy among immigrant population, and the structural integration, if you will, is what we conceptually refer to that process as. Final comment is about Bhutanese and Burmese. I'm glad you asked because these two refugee groups are recent arrival, and in a previous paper on refugee, I looked at them. One is highly selected, one is not. The Bhutanese are off the chart compared to the non-migrants, and the Burmese are negatively selected compared to the non-migrants who left behind. And that was when I had the inspiration for this paper, because I've written a series of papers about like educational achievement among Asian Americans for the largest groups. And they're all exceptional or at least more than average. And then I look at this refugee group and they're struggling basically. And that pointed to two very different narratives that come up, depends on the group that you look at, right? And that's when I said, what about looking at all of them together? What do you see when you bring them together? And that's what I would trying to do in this paper. So I would expect that all else being equal because of legal status and racial category, that the Bhutanese would do better than the Burmese over time, just pure social class background. Even if they cannot translate educational achievement into US credential, the fact that they came with a lot of education meant that they can navigate the society much better than the much less educated Burmese Americans that are here. And therefore their children, all else being equal, stratification, social class reproduction, Wisconsin is here, so I don't have to say more. You expect that they do better over time. So there's a lot of heterogeneity, but fundamentally, I think we can think about them in these ways, that hopefully would help a little bit more. And that's our aspiration.
Great. On that note, join me in thanking Van for